Good morning, Nona Church family. Hey, online is joining us today as well as our Moss Park campus. Let's make a ton of noise and welcome in our locations today. So thankful that you are with us. And what a special day it is at both of our campuses today as we celebrate what God has done in the last year. God has done some amazing things here, and it really is amazing to think about what the last year has meant at Nona Church. You need to know this. In the last year, our church's average attendance has more than doubled. God is doing amazing things here. 1,300 folks have filled out a new here card for the first time in the last 12 months. We've seen hundreds of new people step into community, into volunteering, and celebrate this with me. 150 baptisms so far in the last year since we've launched this campus. Just amazing to see what God is doing. And I do want to say a special thank you to our Moss Park campus. It's amazing to think that a year ago, 200 or so volunteers from our Moss Park campus that live in the St. Cloud area launched with us as we opened up this brand new facility. And there are hundreds of you at the Moss Park campus that have given, that have served, and that have prayed. And because of your generosity, because of your faithfulness, we're celebrating a church that has doubled in size. Hundreds of people have taken their next best step in following Jesus. And for a number of people that are at our Narcoossee campus today, it's because of the generosity of folks that you have yet to meet that have invested in this place that has created this kind of environment. So would you make a ton of noise? And can we thank our Moss Park campus? We love you, Moss Park. So grateful for you and so excited to be with you next week as we continue on in our series, Among Lions. Would y'all say Among Lions with me on the count of three? 1, 2, 3. Among Lions. This series is a series that we started a number of weeks ago here at our church where we decided to go verse by verse through the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. Daniel is an ancient story that's been given to us. It's over 2,500 years old about these young Hebrew Jewish boys that were taken into captivity by the Babylonian Empire, and their journey to not only survive in the midst of a foreign land and a foreign culture, but to thrive in the midst of it. And what we've been gleaning from this text is how God, through the power of his Spirit and his presence, allows us to walk in courage in a culture that wants us to have none. And I could not think of a more poignant discussion for us and Bible study for us in the course of this season of our life than learning as followers of Jesus how to be people that have courage. At all of our campuses today, if you believe we need more courage in 2024, can I get a good amen? Do we believe that? We need more courage in 2024. And so today, we pick up in Daniel chapter 5, and we're going to be asking an important question today. It's this question: how do you make the most of your life? How do you make the most of your life? Because here's what I know about you. Here's what I know about all of us. We want to do something that matters. We want there to be significance in the days that we spend here on this side of eternity. And sometimes it can be hard to know in the midst of screaming kids or in the midst of trying to make rent or pay a mortgage or figure out what's going on, what TV show to watch on Netflix. It can be hard sometimes to know whether or not what we're doing actually matters. And how do we maximize the days, the weeks, and the months and the years of our life? Well, today's story, I think, is going to be very helpful for us in that regard. And I've got to be honest with you, I am really looking forward to giving today's message because the story that we're looking at today is a story that for me personally matters a ton. I started researching and preparing messages on this particular text about 12 years ago. And since that time, probably every 3 months or so, I find myself coming back to this passage in Daniel chapter 5 and allowing it to shape me and to form me. And I might say this, that in a lot of ways, what we're going to study today and look at today has had a profound impact on the way that I think about my days. And I'm looking forward to being able to unpack this story with you because of how much it means to me. In fact, one of the things that I love about this story is that for centuries, people believed that it was a fictional story. And the reason why they believed that is because there was a man that's included in the story. He's kind of one of the main characters, a man by the name of Belshazzar that for centuries people believed was not a real guy. There's this ancient historian by the name of Herodotus who mentions and says that there's a king in the Babylonian Empire, a man by the name of Belshazzar, that Herodotus, this ancient historian, talked about. But there was no verifiable evidence that this guy ever lived or existed. So for a long time, people used to discredit the Bible and the story of Daniel because of chapter 5. They said this never happened, and the reason why we know it didn't happen is because Belshazzar is a fictional character. He doesn't exist until 1853, when a man, an archaeologist by the name of John George Taylor, you know that you're a baller when your name is 3 first names, John George Taylor, discovered artifacts and evidence that Belshazzar was not a fictional character. He wasn't like a character from the Avengers. This guy actually lived. And he happened to be the king in the city of Babylon on the day that this story happens. So can I give you some context about what we're looking at in Daniel chapter 5? Well, in Daniel chapter 4, we learned last week that King Nebuchadnezzar, who is historically verifiable as the king of Babylon, he goes through a mental breakdown, some kind of lapse, and he begins to kind of live in a way that is not what you would expect a king to live. He's struggling. The text tells us that he ends up eating grass like cows do, that he might even imagine for a season of time that he was an animal. And then he has an aha moment as his brain is kind of trying to find itself, that over the course of weeks and months, that the God that Daniel has been worshiping is the God, not just a God, but the God of the universe. In other words, Daniel chapter 1 through 3, we see over and over again, Nebuchadnezzar have some brush up moments where he talks about the God of Daniel as maybe like a good guy, maybe one of the good gods. But then in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar communicates that this God that Daniel worships must be the God because of his ability and capacity to even help Nebuchadnezzar get through his season. Well, it's been 40 years since Daniel chapter 4 concludes before we get to Daniel chapter 5. And in that 40-year span, King Nebuchadnezzar has died. In fact, he's been dead now for 23 years. And the Babylonian Empire, which has historically been the most powerful empire, it's beginning to lose its power in the midst of the region. In fact, in a 20-year span, the Babylonian Empire goes through 4 different kings. It is a mess. It's kind of like UCF football going through 4 different coaches in about 20 years. Again, I make fun of UCF football. Have you seen my Gators lately? It's tough out here, right? This lack of consistency and this lack of leadership has led the Babylonian Empire to begin to fall apart at the seams. So there's a new empire that is rising up among the people, and it's called the Persian Empire. And it's led by a man named Cyrus the Great. So here we are in this moment in history where Cyrus the Great is beginning to come onto the scene, that the Babylonian Empire is the most powerful empire at that moment, but beginning to lose steam. And the king, who's now the 4th in line by the name of Nabonidus, leaves the city of Babylon to go lead his men to war against the Persian Empire in hopes that he can stave off this emerging empire that's come to take their place. And while Nabonidus leaves to go to war, he puts into power a young man by the name of Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is now known as the king of the city of Babylon because daddy has left the house and he's gone to war. Now, if you're Belshazzar, you've got to understand that this moment's a big deal. I mean, you get to be in charge. I want you to imagine for a minute. Do you guys remember this? Some of you do, especially back in the 80s and the 90s when this was way more common, where mom and dad would go on a trip and they would leave you at home by yourself. Do you guys remember this, right? Like apparently, according to the movies that came out in the 80s and 90s, it was totally normal for a parent to leave their 15-year-old in charge of the house for like weeks on end. I don't know if that actually happened, but that's what the movies told me, and I believe the movies, all right? But you remember this, right? Like mom and dad go away for a night out, right? And you've got the house to yourself, right? And you ask your parents if you could have a couple friends over. And a couple friends turns into the entire city. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? Don't act like you don't have a past. I know that you have a past in this place. I've heard the stories, all right? Well, Belshazzar is in a very interesting place because he's in his mid-30s. He's got a newfound sense of power, and his dad's gone off to war, and he's never had a moment in his life where things have not felt secure because he's in one of the greatest cities that has ever been built. There were three things that were going for Belshazzar. The first one is this, is that the city of Babylon seemed impossible to overcome because it had impenetrable walls. I want to give you some context so you can imagine this for a minute. The Babylonian Empire, the city of Babylon, was surrounded by walls that were 350 feet high, and they were 87 feet thick, all brick. I mean, to give you context, that's a football field in the air, and it's a basketball court worth of width. You could literally take a chariot with 4 horses and turn the chariot with all 4 horses on the top of that wall and be able to do it seamlessly. Belshazzar found himself in a place where whatever was going on out there wasn't going to affect anything that was going on in here because the walls were impenetrable. Beyond that, Babylon also had an unmatched advantage. Not only did they have walls that were 350 feet high, but they had towers that helped them look out to see what was going on the horizon that were 400 feet tall. Now, I did some research to ask the question, what's the visibility like if you are in a tower that's 400 feet tall? And I want you to think about this. This is back in the day where there aren't a whole lot of other tall buildings. So what's the visibility? If you're at our Narcousie campus, I want you to imagine that if you were in a 400-foot tower and it was clear visibility, that you would be able to see what was going on at the Kia Center where the Orlando Magic play from our Narcousie campus. If you were at our Moss Park campus, you could see what was going on at Epcot if you were in a 400-foot tower. It's about that distance or that length. In other words, they had an unmatched advantage because if people were marching against them, they had about 26 to 30 miles of time to know what was going on, which would give them the time that they needed to get everybody in place, and they could shoot from the top of those towers to make sure that nobody could even get close to the walls of Babylon. And beyond that, Babylon had endless resources. The Euphrates River was one of the largest rivers that flowed through the ancient Near East, and it was found within the very city of Babylon. Like it flew through, or it went right through flowed right through the city of Babylon. So if you were to go under siege, you had a water supply that could not be messed with because it was so large, which meant you didn't need anything from the outside world to be able to survive inside the walls of Babylon. Now I want to ask you this question. How awesome would that be if that was your life? Like imagine this for a minute, that you were in a financial place in space where nothing could touch you. Like inflation didn't matter because you had so much money. Like when inflation was moving on, you weren't stressed about it because the price of eggs didn't matter because you could buy the farm if you wanted to. Anybody like, that sounds great. Like imagine if you were in a world, right, where you had an endless supply of Diet Coke streaming through your house. Imagine that you knew what was going to happen in the economy because you had 26 miles or 26 years of advance notice to be able to know what was going on. Anybody like, I would have bought more stock in NVIDIA and Apple and would not have bought cryptocurrency, right? Like anybody like that, that's where we are, right? Like I want you to understand, Belshazzar has it made in the shade. He's the richest person in the richest city, and there's nothing that can stop him and nothing he has to worry about. And if we're honest with ourselves, oftentimes the question, how can I make the most of my life? It goes to war with another question, which is how can I stay as comfortable as possible. And this is the tension that many of us feel in our personal lives, isn't it? Like, we want to make a difference, but we also want nobody to bother us. We want to have amazing kids, but we don't want to have to deal with them at 3 o'clock in the morning. We want to have progress in our career, but we don't want our boss to ever talk to us unless it's from 9 o'clock to 4 o'clock, because let's be honest, we're not working till 5 because we're work from home anyway. A little too close to home? And this tension of our comfort and this internal call for us to make a difference, to live a life that matters, it's at war with each other. And the reason why I love Daniel chapter 5 so much, why this story has meant the world to me, is that in many ways it serves as a cautionary tale. If you and I allow the pursuit of impenetrable walls or advanced notice or having the life that we want to become our primary goal. In fact, the story kind of picks up in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1, where we see what happens as a result of Belshazzar having unfettered access to whatever he wants, because that access leads to excess. We find this in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. It says that King Belshazzar made a great feast for, look at this, 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. In other words, Dad, I'm going to throw a party. A few friends are coming over, and by a few friends, I mean 1,000 people are coming over. What we see next in verse 2 is this, is that Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, really his grandfather, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. The verse continues on that says, then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So here's what's going on. Belshazzar has a party. Any parents, like if you had 1,000 people over my house with endless alcohol, anybody like, I would not want that for my children? Anybody thinking that, right? Belshazzar is like, this is the party I'm throwing, all right? I don't want you to think of this party as like, a nice, quaint, put together party, okay? This is more like 50 Cent in the club, more like Bad Bunny, more like a Pitbull party than it is, a party that's like high tea with the pinky out. Like, this is not the party we're talking about. Like, this is debaucherous. It's crazy. The music is pumping, like, like it's going. All right? The alcohol is flowing. They're like, tonight's the night, and we're going to party forever, forever young, right? Like, that's the energy that is in this place. And in the midst of this party, something very, very creepy happens. And it's creepy because it's not something that you would expect in this moment. You see, it's not just that Belshazzar has thrown a party, but he has decided that the way that he's going to theme the party is by reflecting on all of the countries and all of the people that his family has conquered. So he tells his friends, go into my father's souvenir room, into the temple, and get all of the idols of all of the gods that we have destroyed over our conquest over the last 100 or so years. Now, they do not have an idol for the Hebrew God, because look at me. When they went into the temple of Jerusalem, back when they conquered Israel, there was no idol because our God is not made of stick and stones. So what they took instead were the goblets and the other pieces that were in that temple. And so you got to imagine this, okay? You've got a huge party, and the theme is about all of the countries that we've conquered and all the gods that we've destroyed, and they're making fun of Israel's God by pouring their wine into their goblets that came from Israel, by breaking the bowls that were used for worship in Israel, and by making a mess of all of it. Anybody feel like that's kind of sacrilegious? Kind of inappropriate? Well, here's the thing that you need to know about God and what happens in the next couple of verses. God is not to be mocked. Like, God has patience, but God has a line. And we find this in Daniel chapter 5. Look what happens, verse 5. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. In other words, they're having a big party, and a human hand just kind of shows up, right? Happy Halloween, and writes on a wall. Now, at this point, I'm sure some people see what's going on, and they're like, wow, this wine is hitting hard right now. But eventually, there's enough people that are sober to know what's going on, and it's a little bit freaking everyone out. So it says this, and the king saw the hand as it wrote, and then the king's color changed. In other words, he went white. And his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Like, I love the poetic writing of Daniel, right? It's like the king's like, tonight's the night, goes white, and he's just like this. Like, it's just such a funny thing to me. So he sees this happen. It says this, that the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. Again, this is the category of wise men that in Daniel chapter 1 and 2 almost lost their lives until Daniel came to save the day. Now remember, it's been 40 years, and Belshazzar didn't learn the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had learned, so he's calling all these ancient guys that are all into this witchcraft and weird stuff, right? Hey, let me, what's your sign? Like that kind of energy, right? To try to figure out how to solve the problem. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon this, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple. In other words, purple was the most expensive cloth. It was the cloth of royalty. It was dyed. If you wore purple, it was like wearing a full Louis Vuitton outfit, and like the real stuff, not the fake stuff you get in New York, like the real stuff, all right? And have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be, look at this, the third ruler in the kingdom. Why the third ruler? Because daddy's number one. Belshazzar isn't interested in giving up number 2, so you could be number 3. Like, you can't be Michael Jordan. You can't be Scottie Pippen. You could be like Steve Kerr or Luke Longley, but you could be a part of this, right? The text says, and all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. In other words, the people who are supposed to help Belshazzar in his mind cannot help. And at this moment, the music stops, the lights come on, the mascara is running, the buzz is killed, and everyone's looking at Belshazzar like, man, why is there a human hand on the wall still? And why don't we know what is written there? The queen, verse 10, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. Again, I love the detail. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Look at this. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, I love how she's like, your father, your daddy, your father, the king, just to be sure, Belshazzar, that's not you. Your father, the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because he had, and look at this, an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, to explain riddles and solve problems, were found in this, say it with me, in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. And I love this. I mean, it has been over 40 years, really about 50 or so, 50 or 60 years, that Daniel has been transported to Babylon. And his reputation is that while King Nebuchadnezzar named him Belteshazzar, the queen still calls him by his Hebrew name. Why? Because Daniel has lived a life of excellence, of knowledge, and understanding. Look here. Your personal integrity and your faithfulness to who God calls you to be in the midst of a culture that is not interested in him or against him will stand the test of time. And here's Daniel. Daniel's in an interesting position because he's not at the party. Because Daniel's been forgotten. Belshazzar hasn't even given thought to calling on the man that his father's father would have called on in his time of need. Verse 10 through 12 says, now, let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So I want to give a quick note here before I move on, because it's important for us to get a good sense of the context. It's been 40 years since Daniel has been called upon for help. King Nebuchadnezzar seemingly has had this powerful moment with God in Daniel chapter 4, where his life has been changed. Now, we don't know, and history doesn't tell us, if that was a salvation moment that King Nebuchadnezzar had, or if it was more so an awareness of who the God of Daniel was, but his pride in the end never let him bow the knee. We're not sure how the story of Nebuchadnezzar ends. We're not given that opportunity to see it in the text. But here's what we know, that Daniel's God has been respected by the king, that Daniel has become the second most influential man as a result of his faithfulness to God and his courage to walk with conviction. But it's been 40 years, and as the Babylonian Empire begins to fall apart, Daniel's storyline seems to fade into the background. He becomes less and less important. And there are a couple of key observations that we need to be aware of, especially when we live in our Babylon moment today. The first one is this: there is no guarantee that the culture that we're in will bow its knee to King Jesus. There is no guarantee that the culture that we're a part of will make the decisions that we wish the culture would make because they honor God, respect him, and revere him. But here's what we do know. When followers of Jesus make the decision to remain faithful, to walk with integrity, to do what's best even when it comes at a high cost, to do the right thing even though it's the hard thing, even when others are doing the easy thing, when we choose to stand with courage, everyone around us flourishes. But the more that we either get pushed to the margins or choose to retreat to the margins, the cost comes for everyone. And I don't think it's coincidental that the Babylonian Empire is falling apart at the same time that they forget to lean on the wisdom of the man who walks with God named Daniel. And our call and responsibility as followers of Jesus in this cultural moment and day is to not shrink back, to not run for the hills, but to stay engaged. Because while we may not be able to control an outcome, we know that when we are present, things are better. So, Daniel has been forgotten. It's been 40 years. He's probably in his late 50s to early 60s at this point. And what happens in the context of Daniel's life is oftentimes what can happen in our life as well. The way that I like to think about it is this way: that what one culture accepts, the next culture forgets, and the third generation rejects. Belshazzar is making fun of the God that King Nebuchadnezzar bowed his knee to in chapter 4. And it's been 40 years. So here's Daniel's predicament. He hasn't been called upon for a long time. Should he go? Well, he decides to. And we find this in verse 13. Then Daniel was brought before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now, the wise men, the enchanters, they've been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations," and I love this, "solve problems." Followers of Jesus, no matter what culture you're a part of, no matter how messed up it is at the job, no matter how weird it is at your PTA, listen, followers of Jesus have a job. We solve problems. He says this: "Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Which I find hilarious, because what has Daniel been? The second ruler in the kingdom. Do you think Daniel is interested in Belshazzar's request? Do you think the rewards are what is getting Daniel to go? No. Because Daniel has lived long enough to know what really matters. And yet, he chooses to come out of retirement. And in verse 17, look at what he says. "Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another." In other words, I cannot be bought. "Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave." You all say that with me on the count of three, all of our locations. 1, 2, 3. the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your father, kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and language trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne. This is Daniel chapter 4 being explained, and Belshazzar being reminded of what actually happened to proud men like him. He says this, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast. And his dwelling was with wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the what? Most High God rules. One more time, say it with your chest now. The Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. In other words, Belshazzar, it's important for you to learn the lesson that your grandfather had to learn too. That God is in charge of who's in charge. That God is in charge of who's in charge. You might think that you are in control of your life. You might think that if you are smart enough to outwork the system or to outsmart the system, that you too can have impenetrable walls, have an advantage that nobody else has, have endless resources. But my friend, it's important to know, just like your dad needed to know and your grandfather needed to know, that all of those good things that seem like they come from you are actually gifts from him. And Daniel continues on by saying, and you, his son Belshazzar, have not. You haven't humbled your heart, though, look at this phrase, you knew all this. Like Nebuchadnezzar didn't know about the God of Israel until he met the God of Israel. But Belshazzar, you've heard these stories since you were a young boy. You knew what your grandfather went through. You knew about the God that he bent his knee to. And yet, knowing all of this, you still have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines, they have drunk wine from them. You've desecrated the holy things of God. And it's not about the bowl or the goblet, it's about your attitude to the God who has been your provider and protector. And you've praised instead the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. You have chased after things that give no life and have no life. But the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Daniel tells Belshazzar, you knew better. You chose dishonor and you turned to idols. Because what one generation accepts, the next generation forgets, and the third generation rejects. And within 3 generations, what was once valued is now made fun of and rejected. And some of you are old enough to remember that it was assumed that married people tried to stay married. It was assumed that authority was meant to be honored. It was assumed that service was meant to be celebrated. How far we have fallen from some basic convictions in our own culture. And Daniel says this in chapter 5, verse 24, then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. In other words, the hand on the wall comes from God. The writing is on the wall, Belshazzar. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. In other words, Belshazzar, your days are numbered. You have been held accountable, and your stuff is temporary. So here's where things get really interesting for me, is that while this party is happening, what Belshazzar doesn't know is that his father Nabonidus, at the Battle of Opis in modern-day Iraq, has been captured by Cyrus the Great and summarily executed. But Belshazzar doesn't know this because there is no find my friends, no text message, and no email. He knows his dad's out to war, but he doesn't know what's happened to his dad. And he's convinced that even if something bad happens to his dad, that no one is going to break through the walls of Babylon. And if anything's coming, surely they're going to see it before anybody else does. But what he doesn't know is that after Cyrus the Great has captured Nabonidus, for weeks, some might even say for months prior, miles north of the city, the Persian Empire has been slowly building canals that divert the water of the Euphrates River away from its normal flow and has reduced the water table slowly over days and weeks so that the Persian Empire over the cloak of night can send their army with their heads just above water and walk through the Euphrates River underneath the walls and into the city of Babylon. And on that night, when Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin is written, the Persian Empire pops out from underneath those walls in the Euphrates River, while thousands of lords are drunk and not paying attention. The city of Babylon falls like that, and Belshazzar is executed. And it's a cautionary tale and a real reminder for all of us that the things that we think are going to hold us up are not. That the things that we think make us impenetrable or unstoppable or unavoidable, they're not. And this story I read every couple of months as a reminder to me personally about how fragile life is, how painful pride can be, and how much the cost of pride can become. And today, as we conclude our time, I want to give you 3 things that I reflect on when I read this story that I try to remember in my own life, a mantra, if you will, to keep me humble and to remember that as good as this gets, as nice as things become, as comfortable as life is, that those things in the end are not the pursuit. Making a difference is. I want to give you today, as we close, 3 reminders that will help you. 3 reminders that will help you make your days and your life count. The first one is this. I want y'all to say it with me. My stuff is temporary. Say that on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. My stuff is temporary. Parsin, the stuff that you've had, it's going to be divided up and given to another. I think it is an important reminder for us to know that the pursuit of more will not lead to our happiness, our joy, or our satisfaction. In fact, I know this. I'm in the process of car shopping right now, which is my least favorite thing in the world. And here's the thing about cars, right? Every couple of years, they change the look of the car, so that way when you buy the car that you bought, you feel like you're a loser because you don't have the new version of the car. It's crazy, isn't it? A new car, when you drive it off the lot, is 9% less value than it was the moment that you bought it. Within 4 years, that new car has lost 50% of its value. And yet we live in a culture and a world where the car that we drive in many ways can serve as a status symbol. And listen, I like nice things, and there's nothing wrong with having nice things. But I think it's a good reminder for us, isn't it, that we live in a culture that is constantly trying to tell us if you have the new thing, the best thing, or the coolest thing, then you are the thing. And I think a good question that we should ask ourselves, and a question I ask myself often is this, is what are you holding on to that will eventually be taken from you? My stuff is temporary. Here's the second thing that I think we need to remember. It's the thing I try to say all the time to myself. My stuff is temporary. Here's the second one. My decisions matter. Say that with me on the count of 3, all of our campuses. 1, 2, 3. My decisions matter. In other words, what I choose to do today can have an impact on tomorrow. How I choose to show up today, either prideful or humble, has an impact on how God relates to me. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Man, what I do, how I spend my money, where I spend my time, how I speak to that person at the counter, how I choose to interact with people that I don't know and people I do know, all of those decisions matter. Whether or not I stand with courage in my vocation or you stand in courage in your vocation, all of it matters. Tekel, you're going to be held accountable for your decisions. Parsin, your days and your stuff is temporary. Tekel, your decisions matter. And the last one, mene, is that your days count. Your days count. I would say this, if your decisions matter, ask yourself this question: where have you delayed disobedience? Where have you delayed obedience? Because delayed obedience is still disobedience. And the last one, my days count. My days count. I went to my buddy's church last week. I had the opportunity to preach in Baltimore and went around his church building. We do this as pastors. We look at church buildings and are like, oh, what did you do here? I wish I would have done that. And I went into his office, and he had this really interesting thing on his office. It was a sheet that looked like this. All of you have one. It was framed over his office desk, and it had these two words, memento mori. The words memento mori. And then on it, he had a bunch of little dots that he had filled out. And the phrase memento mori is this Latin phrase that means remember your death. And the story that Tertullian, a church father, says is there was a powerful man in the Roman Empire who won a lot of wars. And every time he would come home and won a battle, there'd be a huge celebration for him. And that as he walked through the triumphal celebration, there'd be a man whose job was to simply stand behind him as people were celebrating his, chanting his name, and to say to him over and over again, you are just a man, memento mori. You are just a man, remember your death. And my buddy, he kind of inspired me to do this too. He decided to take this document that's got a little dot for every single week of his life up until 90. And every week when he comes into the office on Monday morning, he circles and he fills in one more week as a reminder that week is gone. Here's what I want to challenge all of you to do over the course of this week is to take this document, figure out how old you are, and fill out all of the little blocks. And I want you to put it in your formation journal, because there's something about remembering that your days count, your weeks count, and the week's gone. And allow that to affect whether you go home to have dinner with your kids, whether you pick up flowers for your wife, whether you choose to go on that trip or keep on harboring money for the rainy day that might come, but you've lost a ton of memories along the way. Memento mori. Memento mori. I think when you and I live this way, remembering this reality, we live out what the psalmist tells us in Psalm 90, verse 12. Teach us to number our days that we might get a heart of wisdom. The reason why we remember that our days count is so that we would be wise with the days that we have. And here's the question I would leave you with. What would you do differently if you were aware of how much time you have left? Because in the end, we know this to be true. Your stuff is temporary, your decisions matter, and your days count. So here's the next step for today's message. Fill out the memento mori card. Put it somewhere where you're going to see it, your formation journal, your office, your desk. Fill it out every week and be reminded of how much time is gone and how much is left. And do the things that matter, because those things will one day be measured. And here's the last thing I want to invite you to do as the next step. I want you to make a courageous decision. At all of our campuses right now, I'm going to invite you to stand up. And I've got a list of courageous decisions that you can take. And when you come across the courageous decision that you're called to take, I want you to stand in courage and open your hand and say, Lord, that one is for me. Make a courageous decision. For some of you, it's about choosing baptism. We've got one more baptism in the month of November, and you have not gone public with your faith, and that's the courageous step. Would you open your hand and say, I'm going to choose baptism. I'm going to fill out that card. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to let the world know that Jesus is my Savior and my King. For others, it's about asking for prayer. At all of our campuses today, after our services, we'll have a prayer team available, and you're going through something, and you're going through it alone. Let today be the last day you go through it alone, because you make the courageous step to walk forward and say, hey, would you join me in praying for this thing that I'm carrying, this weight that I'm holding, this desire that I have? For others, it's about returning the tithe. The biggest way for you to realize that your stuff is temporary is to participate in the act of returning your first and your best to God as a reminder that I don't need all of this because God is my source and my provider. For others, it's about asking her out on a date. Some of y'all need to open your hand right now. Because you don't know what's on the other side of your willingness to risk. Your willingness to step out with the potential of rejection. The resilience you're gonna build because you choose to do something that is outside of your comfort zone. For others, it's about filling out the blueprint card and coming and getting involved. For others, it's about giving and seeking forgiveness. For some of you, you need to forgive them because the weight of unforgiveness has been crushing you. For others of you, it's about humility. It's going to your spouse, going to your friend, going to your roommate and say, hey, I was wrong. And I struggle with saying that I was wrong, and I don't like admitting that I'm wrong, but would you help me? And would you forgive me? For others, it's about admitting you need help or getting honest with a friend. But at all of our campuses right now, with all of our eyes closed, if you know that there's a next step for you to take, would you just open your hand where you are and let me pray for you? Father, we want to become a courageous people that walk with conviction because we need it in our culture. Father, would you give every person at all of our campuses and locations, those that are watching online, the capacity, the heart, the passion to live with the kind of courage in their life that would allow them to remember that our stuff is temporary, our decisions matter. So God, would you help us make these days count? We thank you that because of Jesus, what feels temporary is temporary because we've been given an eternity. We know that our decisions matter because, God, we matter to you. And God, we know that our days count because you have counted us as part of your family. It's because of Jesus that we can get up when we need grace, move forward when we fail, and walk with courage because you're with us. These are the things we thank you for. In Jesus' name. Everybody in this place says, amen and amen.
Amen.